Yo, what's up everybody? Laghima here. So the last tutorial I did on music theory went over pretty well. You guys didn't like it a lot. So this tutorial here is just a more advanced version of that last tutorial. So it's going to cover such things as an in-depth study of chords and scales with some new chord types that I mentioned before, such as passing chords and staying chords, as well as an in-depth study of sampling and how to transpose and get your samples not only in key, but also transpose two samples and use them together, as well as how to use autotune and other applications like that are common in music. So anyways guys, let's go ahead and get into it. So I covered scales last time, but this time I'm just going to go a little bit more in depth just to kind of really express kind of everything that there is to talk about with scales. So last time I discussed that every scale degree has a chord associated with it, and obviously all those chords relate somehow. So that's kind of generally what I expressed to kind of give you guys like a general idea of how scales and chords work. So another thing to express about scales is that every scale degree has a functionality with it. So the circle of fifths has 7 functionalities associated with these 7 scale degrees, and the same thing with the circle of fourths. So I'm going to express all the functionalities of the circle of fifths and circle of fourths on the screen so you guys can see it. But for the tutorial's sake, I'm going to be using the circle of fifths solely. So the first thing you talk about is with the circle of fifths. So with the circle of fifths, the first note in or first chord in any given scale is called a tonic. So since we're in C major, our tonic is going to be C. Then our super tonic would be D. Our immediate would be E. Our subdominant would be F. Then G would be the actual dominant. A would be the submediate, and then B would be the leading tone, going back to the tonic. So as you can see, what we did there is that we the scale degrees and what their functionality is. But what do those functionalities actually do? So I'm not going to go through each one. I'm just going to kind of express the main and really important two and the concept behind those 2 scale degrees. So the 1, which is the C, and the 5, which is the G major chord, are pretty much the most important scale degrees. And the reason why is that G is used for resolution. So resolution means the release of tension. And it's the most powerful chord that releases the most tension. So that's, for example, why 1-5-1 or C major going to G major back to C major sounds really good. And as you can see, when we go from C, G, there's no tension left. All the tension has been resolved. But if I played a 1-4-1, because the 4 and the 5 share a very similar function, although the 4 does not resolve as well, you'll see that there's still some tension left over once the chord progression is resolved. So I'm going to play a 1-4-1, which is C major, E minor, C major. And as you can see, it does resolve, but there's a lot more tension left over. And the reason why is because even though the 4, the 4, which is the subdominant, has a dominant-like function, it is still not the dominant. So it's not going to resolve as well. Which brings me to the main point of these, is the aspect that the further you get away from the 1 chord or the tonic, the more tension more tension you're going to encounter. So for example, if I play the C major scale, you can very nicely see that the further I got away from the C note, the actual more tension we felt, and it eventually became resolved when we went from B to C, because all that tension we built up is now resting. So our tonic is always going to be our resting position, and all we're doing is in any given chord progression or melody, we're going from the resting position, building up tension and then resolving that tension. And this is generally how we express it, which is tension and release. So for example, I play 1 chord, we're resting, there's no tension built up, then I play like a 2, We have a little bit of tension. Then after that, I play, let's say, 6, a lot of tension, and then I go back to the 1. There's still some tension left over, obviously, but it's a lot less. And then now we are at the resting chord again, and now we go another journey, which is playing some other arbitrary chord progression and coming back to the 1. So that's why I said in the last tutorial that any chord progression you ever have will always start on the 1, because that is your resting position. So you start on the 1, play your chord progression, and come back. Okay, since now we covered that, let's actually cover more in depth about chord progressions. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take this and move to the side real quick, and so we're going to express some stuff. So let me zero this out. So when you're building chord progressions, for example, a 1, 5, and then 1 again. Actually, let's do like a 1, 6, or 1, 2, 6, 1. The first chord you choose in your chord progression is always going to be the tonic. Then the second chord you choose is whatever you want. And then every chord after proceeding needs to resolve correctly, or needs to build up tension correctly. That's a better way to put it. So in this case, what I've done is I've chosen the 2, the 6, and then back to the 1. So why does this work? And if I play, you actually see that it does work as well. Just kind of the proof of concept. So as you can hear, that sounds decent. So why does it sound decent? Why does it sound good? Well, from the 1 chord, that's always, you have to choose the 1. The second chord, it's regardless, whatever you choose, it's arbitrary. And the chord after that, you always choose relatively a relation of fifths or fourths away. So for example, from 2 to 6 is a relation of fifths. And so I can show you like this. So if I go 1, here's a D. So put all these up here real quick. All right, so 1, 2, 3, 4, 5. And as you can see, from 2 to 6 is 5. It's a count of 5 away. I could also have chosen the G major chord as well, because it's relation of fourths. 1, 2, 3, 4. So either or is valid, either a relation of fifths away or a relation of fourths away, speaking in terms of the circle of fifths. And like I said, this whole tutorial is in the circle of fifths. So either or could be chosen. So I just chose the relation of fifths away just because I wanted to. So there's really no, outside of that, there's really no reason why. And then from 6 to 1, we know that obviously we can go from 7 to 1, right? There's going to be a lot of tension that gets released. It's going to be very dramatic. So obviously if we're going from 6 to 1, there's going to be less tension. So that's how I got from blank to blank. So that's why the chord progression kind of sounds fine. But that's just general. What if you actually wanted to make a more purposeful chord progression? So for instance, like a sad one and a happy scale. So you want to use a predominance of first minor chords, because minor chords have more dissonance and they're more emotional. And then also along with that, you would want to use those very in close in tandem to each other. So a minor chord after a minor chord after a minor chord. Because the more minor chords you play, the more tension you're going to build up. And then the more minor chords you play, the more tension you build up. And also the further those chords are away from the tonic, the more tension you're going to build up as well. So here I have a chord progression just using like a stock Omni Spirit patch that I'm going to use to play a sad chord progression. So the chord progression is 1, 3, 6, 2, 5, 1. So we're going to hear that it sounds very sad. So I'm going to play it real quick. So obviously it's a very emotional chord progression. And the reason why is that first off, I have a predominance of minor chords, because we know in any major scale, the 2, the 6, the 3, and the 7, I believe as well, are all minor chords. So in this one, I have a 2, and I have a 3, then the 6, then the 2, then the 5, which is major. So I have 3 out of my 5 chords, I have 3 that are minor. And then out of the 3 minor chords I have, the 6 and then 3 are very far away from 1, or further away from 1. The 6 being the furthest, the 3 being the next. So with those two concepts combined, I get a very sad sounding chord progression very quickly. So that's things you want to kind of keep in mind when you're making chord progressions, is that you want to make them purposeful. You want to have an idea of what your chord progression should sound like before you actually start making it, because that way you can make chord progressions that sound good and are going after what you're looking for very easily and quickly. And in the next part of the tutorial, we're going to talk about using more distinct type of chords that aren't just major and minor, but carry more functionality with them. So next thing we're going to talk about is going to be something called sustained chords, which are kind of a little bit different from what we've traditionally seen with the traditional major and minor chords. So in the last tutorial, I mentioned that chords come in 2 types, which is major and minor. That is true in the context of a major and minor scale, but actually there's more. So another type of chord is something called a sustained chord. So a sustained chord is distinct from a traditional major or minor chord because unlike those chords, it has no third. So we're actually going to make one. You're going to see what I mean. So this chord right here is a sustained chord, and this is also a sustained chord. So sustained chord comes in 2 types, which are sus4 and sus2, which stands for sustain 2, sustain 4. And they can be done on any note. So for example, we can do it on a C major or a C chord. So if we do make a C sus2, this is what it will sound like, or C sus4, this is what it sounds like. So before talking about kind of more in depth about their functionality, let's talk about actually how to make them. So here's a C major chord, and how we make a C sus2 is that we actually go to the 2 of the chord. So if this is our 1, this is our 3, and this is our 5, because this is normal C major chord, then the 2 would be D. So the C sus2 would look like as follows. And on the opposite end, if we're going to make a sus4, we do the same thing. We would go to the 4th of the chord. So if E is the 3, then F would be the 4. So thus we have a C sus4. So then I'm going to play a chord progression that just goes C sus2 to C major, C sus4 to C major. Let's kind of hear how it sounds, then kind of go over more explanation about what they do and how they function. So as we can hear, there's kind of a lot of interesting things that these sustained chords do. The first thing is that since they have no third, they're neither major or minor. And the reason why is that, as you normally see, we make, for instance, a C major chord. So when we usually make a C major chord, looks like this, and we have a C minor chord, looks like this. If you know, the main difference between these 2 chords is actually just the 3 that is moved. The difference of the 3 makes it a major or minor. But in our sustained case, we have no traditional 3. Our 3 doesn't allude to if it's a major or a minor chord. So for instance, if we were to just move this C upward, take this C, move it upward, this can look like a G sus2. Or if I take both of these, this can be a G sus4. So as you can see, it doesn't really allude to any sort of scale. It's very ambiguous. And that's why sustained chords are very good, because they are used to add ambiguity to your chord progression. It doesn't allude to it being major or minor because there's no 3 present. The distinguishing quality between any chord, or what makes the chord major or minor, is really the 3. The 3 distinguishes the 3rd scale degree of the chord you're using. Distinguishes between a major or minor variety. So when you don't have that, what happens is you get this sort of ambiguous chord that can really add a lot of interesting elements to your chord progression. So if I were to move this back, we would see that usually when a sus chord, we use a sus chord leading into the actual chord itself. So for instance, if I had a C major chord instead of just going into the C major chord, I can play a sustained chord to go into the C major chord. So that's their functionality, is that we use them as kind of like almost going from point A to point D, but adding some nuance. So for instance, imagine you were playing like a 1-5-1. So for instance, this G was G, B, D. And instead of just going into the C major chord, you would play a sus4 and get some more interesting elements to it. So it wouldn't just be from this to that, and I'm just inverting it. So as you can see, that's a lot more interesting than just going both work and both sound fine, but particularly adding a sustained chords adds a lot more interestingness to or adds more interest and variety to your chord progressions. Instead of just going from 2 to 5, you can add in an interesting element in between, and that's a lot of the techniques with adding more interesting elements to your chord progressions is by adding things that are more variegated, that are more nuanced than just kind of the traditional chord progressions that I've been explaining thus far, such as like 1-5-1 or 1-6-2-1 or so forth and so on. Adding these sort of elements can lead to chord progressions that are have more taste to them. They're much more nuanced, like I've been stating. So another thing about sustained chords is that they can be treated like any other chord. So you can invert them, you can add higher degrees to them. So for instance, you can add like a ninth to this. So we obviously know this is, we go back to C. So for instance, this is C sus2. We can even add like a ninth to it, like we would do any other extended chord. So you know that that would be D. And same thing to this, add a ninth. So you can extend them like any other chord. You can do the same thing and also invert them in doing your first, second, and third inversion, so forth and so on. The idea is that you can use the same techniques that I've previously illustrated in the other part of the tutorial and still get much more efficient and much more interesting sounding chord progressions. All right, so next thing we're going to actually talk about is something called a passing chord, or what we like to also call a secondary dominant chord. So what a secondary dominant chord is allows us to pass, or it's kind of like a bridgeway between two chords, but still keeping a very dominant functionality. So I know that sounds really confusing. So instead of just telling you, I'm going to show you. So what I have in front of you is a passing chord, a 1-5-1 chord progression with a passing chord. And the passing chord of this chord right here. So I'm going to play it and then explain how to actually make them and use them. So let's go and play the chord progression. So first, let's talk about what chords you use. So the first thing is that you notice there's an F sharp. And as I've been going through this whole tutorial, you obviously know that every chord progression I make is going to be in C major. So why is there an F sharp then? Because the F sharp is not in the C major scale. This is because that chord is the passing chord. So what is a passing chord? So let me go ahead and do some corrections real quick so you guys can see a little bit more clear. So as you can tell with this chord right here, this is just a G major chord. So this is the 1, this is the 5. So what you would do is, in this case, I'm playing 1, and then I'm going to 5 next, which is this chord, back to 1. So when I go from 1 to 5, instead of just jumping from 1 to 5, I want to use a passing chord in between to add more nuance, to add more flavor to the chord progression. So what I would do is I would go to the G major scale and choose the dominant in terms of the circle of fifths in that scale, which would be the 5th chord. And as we see, the 5th chord is going to be this chord right here, D major chord. So what we do is put that chord in before the G major chord. So it would be as if we're resolving from the 5 of the G major chord to the G major chord itself. So it's really like we're playing the 1 of the C major chord, the 5 of the G major chord to the 1 or the 5 of the C major chord. It's the 1 in the G major chord, but the 5 in the C major chord. That's why this is called a secondary dominant chord, because it's not the dominant in the scale you're in, but the dominant of the dominant. So in this case, the dominant chord in the C major scale is the G major, which is the dominant, it's the 5th scale degree. And the dominant of that chord is actually this F major chord. So that's what's called a secondary dominant. It's used to pass between two chords, or from get you to point A to point D, but by adding more nuance. Point A to point B, but add more nuance to it. And it gives that heavy resolving feel. That's why we would go from the D major chord to the G major chord, it feels like there's already resolution happening, because there actually is, because what we're really doing is playing the 5 of the G major chord to the 1, we're playing the 5 of the G major chord to the 1 of G major, which is the G major chord, but also that functions as the 5 or the dominant of the C major scale. So it's a very interesting chord progression you can use, or chord progression element you can use. You can pass between any chord. So if I were to go from, like, for instance, C major to D minor, which is the 2, I would play in between them the dominant chord of the D minor scale. So forth and so on. So as you can see, it adds a lot. It's a very interesting element, and it really, really beefs up chord progressions. In the same sense, you can add extensions, you can invert it, so forth and so on. So mixing and combining these techniques is going to give your chord progressions a lot more interesting elements to them. So the main thing that's important when it comes to sampling is actually transposition. So what transposition is, it's taking a piece of music and moving it from one key to another. So for instance, here I have these 2 pieces of music. One's a melody, one's a chord progression. One's in D minor, and the other one is in B minor. But in this case, you can kind of see with the melody, it doesn't really have any B minor elements. So for all intents and purposes, I'm just going to say it's A minor or C major, which are equivalent. So with that being the case, with having one that's A minor and another one that's D minor or B minor, if I play them together, it's not going to sound good because they're not in the same key. So as you can see, they sound completely unharmonic together, and it sounds like crap. So what we need to do is we need to actually tune them to be either tune them to be in the same key, or transpose them to be in the same key. So how we can do that is that I can either take the melody and put it in the key of the chord progression, or take the chord progression and put it in the key of the melody, or take both of them and put in a whole separate key. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to take both of them and put them in the key of C minor. So for that case, I'm going to take the chord progression, which is B minor, and move it up 1 semitone. So now it's going to be in C minor. Then I'm going to take the melody, which is an A minor, and leave it in A minor, because all the notes that are in this melody right now are actually present in C minor, so there's not going to be any issues. So now when I play it, it'll sound fine. So as you can hear, that sounds perfectly fine. And even if I fold it, you'll see that we only have all white notes. So I just want to kind of show you guys that, to show you that using proper chords or using proper transposition is like a necessity. If your things aren't in scale or are both in the same scale, it's going to sound like crap all the time. So the same thing can be said when you have something like a sample. So say you're given a one shot. So in this case, I have, let me drag a one shot in here real quick. So say you're given like a one shot sample, for instance. When you're given it, it's going to be tuned to something, or sometimes it may not be. So if it's not tuned to anything, for instance, you're trying to sample like some Foley or something, then you have to tune it to something. So you can use a plugin. A good plugin that I always use is one called Khz Resonator. You can look it up. Really good plugin, and it puts things into a key for you. So for example, you can tune anything to C major. But if you're given a one shot, like this one I have here, it also needs to be tuned to something, because if it's not, it's going to sound unharmonic or not harmonic at all. So in this case, it's tuned to C. So actually when I play it, it's going to be playing the correct notes. So for example, you see the first note is A. So actually if I bring out a tuner real quick, audio effects, you see it's playing the correct melody. And if I play it here, boom, you'll see here it's playing A, D, E, and on the tuner it is also playing A, D, E. So it's playing the correct notes, and also it's playing the notes that I'm actually playing on the keyboard, which is another thing. If your sample is not tuned correctly or not tuned to C, and you're playing it on your keyboard, you may be inserting the MIDI note C, but actually be playing physically something else. So that's just something to keep in mind when you're actually using samples, is that tuning is very essential. And if your things aren't tuned correctly, they're always going to sound like crap, or you're going to be playing wrong notes. So you maybe, if your sample is tuned to G and you haven't tuned your MIDI keyboard to G, then you're going to be playing not whatever you input. You may be inputting a G major chord, but be playing an E flat minor chord. So it can be something totally different. So make sure to just tune your samples correctly. And lastly, actually with auto tune as well, make sure that your auto tune is tuned correctly to your song. Because if it's not, your auto tune as well will sound like crap, because you can think of your voice as actually just being a melody. And if the melody of your voice is not tuned correctly to the melody of your song, then it will also sound like crap. That's actually why we use auto tune, because it keeps us in key, because usually people are not in key, or they're relatively in key, because no one sings C perfectly like a synth will play it. So that's why we have auto-tune to correct those issues. So anyways, I just want to kind of express those stuff for other applications of music theory that aren't usually talked about in kind of music theory courses. I thought were pretty essential, especially for producers and beat makers, because we sample all the time. So anyways, hope you guys enjoy this part of it, and yeah. And that pretty much ended for tutorial today, guys. If you like the video, definitely make sure to consider subscribing. I post all the time, or at least super frequently. If you like the video, also make sure to go ahead and give it a thumbs up and let me know. Also as well, if you want to talk, go ahead and slide in my IG and Twitter DMs at Laghima Beats. I'm on there all the time, super active. Also as well, I didn't manage to get to the jazz theory kind of part of the video that I wanted to, because the video was already kind of running too long. So if you want a jazz theory video going over kind of like R&B chords and all that sort of stuff, let me know in the comment section below, and I'll definitely kind of get to those, as well as like other styles like future bass and stuff. But with that being said, guys, hopefully you enjoyed the video today. I'll see you guys next time. Laghima out.
This program is made possible by annual financial support from viewers like you.